I asked Brynhildur about what kind of group I would have, and the conclusion that we came to was I should give something that is very general. My background in geochemistry, so I will not bother you with any geochemistry, but I will just talk in very general terms on energy resources. So I will touch upon three topics mostly. One is the energy usage in the world at present, and then go down to more detail on geothermal energy, what it is and how it is used and what its importance is. And three, look specifically at geothermal resources in Iceland. This was Brynhildur's request. I want to have this just international. But so first let's look then at the energy resources that we have. And what I have started to do a little bit with PowerPoint, if you only have diagrams and nothing but diagrams, and you look at it after 3 months, you don't know what the heck this is all about. So there is a fair amount of text that hopefully will put you online, and then you have all the diagrams and you understand. So it's like a presentation in the sense of being towards a book, if you like. But the types of energy that we can use today is basically, as many people classify it, as of two types: renewable and non-renewable. But what is so basic to all of this is the first law of thermodynamics, which says that the energy of the universe is just a fixed number. We can only convert one form of energy or nature into another form. So what we are effectively doing, we have some energy resources and we convert it into other energy forms, particularly electric power or momentum, like driving a car. We change one energy into another form. And of course we have fossil fuel first. This is the most important: coal, petroleum, natural gas. And this is non-renewable. It means, in fact, that it just decreases by the amount of consumption, like any mine that we have of metallic ore or whatever the ore is. Then we have hydropower, we have direct solar, we have wind energy that is really coming up, particularly in Europe, and we have biomass. These are renewable energy resources. And then the last two, nuclear, which is non-renewable, and finally geothermal, which is sometimes renewable and sometimes it is not. I want to stop here a little bit about this. You see, the classification of energy resources into renewable and non-renewable is not made by nature. It is made by us. And why? It is a useful classification for policy making or for understanding. When this was first done by the Gro-Harlem-Brundtland Committee some years ago, geothermal was not in the picture. And it so happens that this little energy resource does not fit into the classification. So what would be a more logical but not nearly as simple classification would be to look in more detail at the concept of time. Whether something is renewable or non-renewable has to do with time. So we can say something is perfectly renewable if it if this energy resource, like wind, renews itself at a rate equal to or greater than it is consumed by us or converted into another energy form. Then it is renewable instantly, if you like. And then something is non-renewable, like fossil fuel, because it forms tens of millions of years ago, more hundreds of million years ago, particularly in the case of coal. So it is like a mine. You just mine out, shall we say, chemical compounds, and you can create chemical reaction to release energy. And where does this energy, of course, come from in the very beginning? It's solar energy. And these first 5, fossil fuel and the next 4, this ultimately comes from the sun. I left out tidal energy, some little things. Gravity of the moon, which contributes to tidal energy. So this is not a complete list, but it has the most important ones. And then nuclear and geothermal, this is heat or energy form within the earth. So we have these 2 basic energy resources, solar energy in the beginning, that has many forms, and 2, we have energy from within the earth. So the ultimate source of the solar energy is nuclear fusion. We fuse together hydrogen to form helium, and mass is just one form of energy. So we change the mass a little bit of the sun, and we produce heat instead, another energy form, that is radiated into space. And it is the same with the heat within the earth. Ultimately, it is mass, but that is nuclear fission. As I say, we break up heavy isotopes that are radioactive into lighter elements, and we produce some energy by converting a little bit of mass into heat energy. And the isotopes that are most important for this are 3. Potassium-40, I can write this. We have uranium-238, and we have thorium-232. I don't know where the word uranium comes from. Neither do I know where the name potassium comes from. The thorium is, like for quite a few elements, it is after they haven't got Thor of whatever the reason for it. And this goes way back with Nordic civilization, of course. So this is very basic to understand. These are our energy resources. But then let's look at some diagrams. Maybe you're not too fond of details like this, but I always like to play around with number. But if we take some time on this, you get an impression. So first of all, this is installed electric capacity of power plants that use nuclear energy. Gigawatts. This is a power unit. We have, of course, everybody knows a kilowatt. And 1 kilowatt is the energy, 1 kilojoules per per kilo of something. And if it is kilojoules per second, then we speak of power. How much energy we can produce in a unit of time. So gigawatt is millions of kilowatts. So this is from, you can find this on the web. This is a compilation by the International Energy Agency. And first of all, they have the 6-fold division of the globe into areas. And let's just look at Europe and North America first, you can see nuclear power has been or was coming up in the 1980s quite a lot, and was then up to about separately in Europe and North America about 120 gigawatts in 1990. After that, it has grown very little, but in the last few years it has taken off again. So we are really seeing more nuclear. And you can also see this continuous growth for Asia and Oceania. Oceania is, of course, Indonesia, and Asia is really East Asia, including in India, and then Australia and New Zealand. So they have been growing steadily all the time, increased about 4 times in 25 years. That is quite a lot. The thing is, this is never in the news. So the news is really very biased with, certainly with energy resources. So now it is hydropower. And you can see in North America and Europe, there has been very little growth. There has been growth mostly in 2 places, again in Asia, East Asia. But also, if you can see these little squares where the curve has some slope, and that is Central and South America. So they have been coming up with hydro. And the numbers, they are higher than for nuclear. So we have more hydro to produce energy, electric energy. And then we come to conventional thermal, which is mostly coal, but of course it may be some oil, but mostly coal. And here you can see some growth everywhere, except one place, a huge growth. From 1980 to 2005, you can see Asia is going up from 200 gigawatts up to 800. And it continues to grow. This is mostly India and China using coal for electric generation. This worries the Western world and maybe more areas about global warming. They're really shooting up. But I had a good remark from somebody at Stanford University in California. Said, we need not worry about global warming. Before it becomes too serious, we will have run out of coal. And oil, of course. So this gives you a little bit of an impression. And now I have 2 diagrams. This is 2005. And then you can see conventional thermal is about 2/3. This is the pinkish color. Hydro is almost 20, nuclear is about 10. So you can see what are the energy resources for our electric power generation today. And then we come to geothermal, 0.23%. Nuclear is 1.9, it's some biomass, but it really is a large fraction of it is wind energy today. There is still very little direct solar. And I managed to scrape out numbers for last year, 2009, and you can see the numbers have changed. Nuclear has really come up. Geothermal is about the same. Hydro has gone down a little bit relative, and combustible fuels, all of them, fossil fuel and everything else, this is a newer classification, and this is still 60%. So we are mostly using combustible fuels and nuclear that raise environmental problems, and it is not going to be easy to convert completely to renewable energy resources. Now let's look a little bit at the second topic, geothermal resources. And what is geothermal energy? It really is just the heat that is stored within the earth. Of course, just about all of it in rocks, but some of it in fluids that are mostly meteoric or rainwater by origin that just seeps deep into permeable rocks, few kilometers depth. The basic thing with geothermal is we must have this fluid to transport the water, to transport the heat to the surface. So this is the medium that conveys the heat from depth to the surface. Now we have many types of geothermal systems, although no two geothermal systems are the same. But we see that they occur again and again in the same type of a geological environment. And it is this. I want to bring this forward because we are always trying to make some kind of classifications to be able to communicate better and summarize our understanding. But nature did not do that. We did. So it's not something that you should take as being something 100% right. It is just helps. But we have many types of classifications by many people who have different experiences or who have been working in different places, different countries. But the classification that I like is presented in Encyclopedia of Volcanology, 10 years old, and it covers pretty well the systems that we know of. And there are basically 5 types. We have systems in young volcanic environments. Of course, this is a long term. One usually just calls this volcanic geothermal systems. Then we have tectonic systems. Together, these two are hydrothermal systems. They are characterized by circulation to great depths, few kilometers, of groundwater. And in not all of them, but in most of these systems, likely, certainly the ones that we see, we have the manifestations of hot springs, fumaroles at the surface that really prove that we have a hydrothermal system.
Hydrothermal system as in you have water to carry the energy?
Water is circulating and it's carrying the heat energy up to the surface or to shallower depths. And then we can drill for it. We like to find permeable rock, so we can tap this water. So far today, these are the only systems that we can use economically and technologically. Then we have 3 more types. Hot, dry rock. It means rock that is not permeable. Sometimes people call these enhanced geothermal systems today. It means we want to exploit heat stored in the rock, and most, of course, of the heat within the crust of the earth is in hot, dry rock. So something like 20, 30 years ago, the idea developed, well, 30 years ago it is, can we develop technology to make use of this heat? And so far, we have made some progress, but we do not yet have any use of this heat, although I think we are pretty close in Switzerland, close to the city of Basel, and also in Australia. And then we have geopressurized systems. These are hot water, huge volumes of hot water in sedimentary basins. Maybe the biggest example or is in the south of Texas, around the Gulf of Mexico, where everything is subsiding, and on the geological time scale, we accumulate sediments, and the pore water in the sediments just goes down with the sediments, and gradually they become heated up, and it's the load of the sediments. They will at least try to compress the fluid a little bit, so when you drill, you get like an artesian well. So this is geopressurized. It is overpressured fluid in it due to the load of the overlying sediments. In America, people were really interested in this because some of these sediments, they contain natural gas. So you could produce both natural gas and hot water from this, but for some reason that I do not know of, there is no exploitation so far of this resource. And then we have magma tap system, which is simply making use of heat in magma lakes. This has not been realized either, but in Iceland we have used heat from a new lava. It lasted for 15 years. So these are basically the types of geothermal systems that we have. I will only show you one simplified scheme of the most commonly used type of a geothermal system, the volcanic geothermal system. So this is a simplified section through it. It is really based on many systems that you have on converging plate boundaries. Does everybody know plate tectonics? No. Certainly if you have background in geology. But this is like the ring of fire around the Pacific. And there you have magma intrusions that may consolidate at high levels in the crust where it is already brittle, where it can fracture to give you permeability. And basically the way people envisage this is you have meteoric water coming from the surface, seeping deep down, shown by the arrows, towards the magma body. It doesn't quite reach the magma, although it gets very close. And we have two steps really in the heat transfer from the magma, and one is through a relatively thin layer above the magma where the heat is transferred by conduction through this layer. And then at the top of this layer, this is the bottom of the circulation of the fluid, and then the heat is transferred through the conductive layer and into the fluid. The fluid is heated up, it expands and rises, may get all the way to the surface. It may not go all the way to the surface, it may run off subsurface, so you don't see anything. But this fluid will then carry the heat from the magma further up into the crust. And what this vertical movement of the fluid will do is it will heat up the rock at shallow crustal levels, and by the heat that originally comes from the magma. And this is what we usually call a hydrothermal system, the top of it, where we have a thermal anomaly. The rock at shallow depths are hotter than away from our geothermal system by the vertical ascent, or more or less vertical ascent of the heated fluid. People have been calculating this, not only people in working on geothermal, but also a lot of people who are working on metamorphic rocks. And what always comes out is this layer is very thin. It's only maybe some tens of meters, 50 meters, 100 meters. It's a thin layer between magma and the fluid. So because of this, and what we have seen from deep drillings, is that the gases that are in the magma, they escape into the roof rock, if you like. They dissolve in the fluid. And some of these gases, in particularly hydrochloric acid, HCl, also sulfur dioxide, when they dissolve in water, they make acids. So the fluid here towards the bottom may be acidic. And there have been problems in using this acidic fluid because it's very corrosive. People have been successful in a few places, but unfortunately, the outcome most often is people just give in. And the money they put into drilling these deep wells that struck acidic fluids, sunk costs, but not something that you profit from. What happens, I don't know if you'll be traveling much about Iceland, but I will show it very briefly here, what happens when this hot water, if it is above 100, rises toward the surface, then it will start to boil. So then we have two phases, liquid water ascending together with some steam or vapor. And very often the liquid water may be running off below the surface because the groundwater table is below the surface. So all you see then on the surface is steam vents. And you have your acidic gases in the steam. So you get a lot of alteration at the surface. And if you visit some of these fields in Iceland or anywhere else, this is what strikes the eye, to see the fumaroles and to see the intensive alteration at the surface. Different colors where the ground is hot. And this is the acids that really dissolve the rock and produce all kind of alteration products. Now, generally speaking, the processes that make this kind of alteration on the surface of these systems, they are basically the same as the weathering processes when you produce a laterite soil. You dissolve most things away, you just leave a residue of compounds that make very insoluble minerals under acidic conditions. Now a little bit about the use of geothermal resources. I just spoke what was geothermal heat before and about geothermal systems. So the number is maybe a little higher. There was a big meeting in Bali last month, and there are updates then. Unfortunately for your lecture, I didn't have time to update my slides to see what it was like at the end of 2009. But there has been quite a lot of geothermal development in many places in the world during the last 5 years. But in 2005, this is how much we had installed electric power, from geothermal 0.23%. The geothermal energy is used for basically two types. We use it for power generation. The emphasis has been on that, although direct use, which is the other type of use, has been expanding a lot. But the possibilities of how you can use geothermal energy mostly depend on the temperature of the fluid, the reservoir temperature. So here's a slide showing that if you really look at things in detail, you can use geothermal heat for many different things. Just mention the 5 basic types. You have this slide. We have electricity generation, we have industrial uses, we have agricultural uses, we have space heating, and then we have swimming or balneological uses. I will not bother you too much with numbers, but I think it's useful for you to have these. This is the installed capacity by country. The total in 2005 was almost 9,000 megawatts. So look at the number, 9 gigawatts, where hydro was 150. And fossil in the biggest part of the world, and fossil fuel or combustible fuels, they were running in many thousands of gigawatts, and geothermal is 8. But what I want to point out here is that although geothermal is not important as an energy resource on a global scale, it is very important for many countries, quite particularly countries that are in volcanic regions of the world. And it so happens that many of the countries in such areas are developing countries. So it is important for many developing countries. And you may want to look at the numbers. USA, Philippines, Mexico, Indonesia, and then we go down, El Salvador, Costa Rica, Kenya. And these countries have been coming up slowly, but they have huge resources. I should mention South America in this respect. They have done just about nothing. Bolivia, Peru, Chile, particularly in the west, in the Andes, they have apparently huge potential for geothermal. So this is then a diagram showing how this has increased over the years. From 1960, when the United Nations started to encourage the use of new energy resources, 50 years ago. Sorry?
Could you talk a little bit about the depth of drilling and the economic feasibility for some of these countries? At what depth does it become viable?
Okay, let me answer this. It's 2 parts. Apparently, the way I see this, the depth has not been decided by geological information. It has been more decided by the drilling technology, which is all developed within the oil industry. So people have been drilling deeper and deeper. And maybe they are drilling too deep now. There are too many places where you get too close to the magma and you see acidic fluids. And people had hoped that they could really have good permeability down to great depths. Sometimes they do. But sometimes also they get acidic fluids. So a typical well into a volcanic geothermal system is 2 kilometers. But old wells are shallower, new wells are deeper.
Can you just mention for comparison how deep they do drill in Switzerland, for example?
They were drilling 5 to 4 kilometers into this hot dry rock, and they had temperature of 200, and which is quite high. But of course, this is close to the Alps, where you have elevated gradient. And the plan was to use this both for power generation and for space heating. But when they started to do some injection tests, there were micro earthquakes taking place in the area, and people were afraid that things would really go wrong, and for that reason, the project was terminated, at least for the time being. Well, this is not an easy technology. This has been proved more or less, but it's a huge energy resource. And this is why many countries have been interested in trying to develop a technology that works. When one uses geothermal for power generation, one separates liquid water from vapor at the surface in steam separators. So you only make use of the steam. And how do you make use of it? Simply by expansion. You drop the pressure. You make it expand to rotate a turbine. And of course, if you look at the total heat in the steam, and you use the same energy units for the electricity you produce, it really is poor. 12–14% with turbines today. And then the water is thrown away. So this has really encouraged many people to have multiple use of the resource. And you find this in a few places. We have in fact 2 power plants in Iceland. You generate power, then you use the hot water and also the steam when it has been condensed for heating of fresh water for space heating or home heating mostly. And in the case of Svartsengi, finally you use water from low pressure steam separators for the Blue Lagoon. So in that case, you make use of about 90% of the heat that you bring to the surface. In Svartsengi, where the Blue Lagoon is towards the airport, they have about 50 megawatts electric. They have about, I think it's about 200 megawatts thermal for space heating. I don't know how many megawatts of warm water there is in the Blue Lagoon. But the interesting thing about this is that the heating and the power generation provides very few jobs. But the Blue Lagoon provides about 200 jobs. So instead of throwing this heat away, using it like this, you create more jobs much more than for the rest. So I think the world is beginning to think more and more on these lines, to make the most of the resource, not just leave its development to the power sector. I guess you have read the numbers. You can see how this has increased geothermal from 50 years ago, 420 megawatts. It's something, 2010, I think it's something like 11,000, even more. So it is a fast-growing resource. Some numbers. And you have this. I will not spend any time on it except look at the direct use of geothermal energy by country. And I have both the installed capacity, and I have the energy usage or production per year in terajoules, that is to say thousands of gigajoules. And what we have on top is USA in terms of installed capacity for direct use, and Sweden is number 2. I only want to look at these two. And the total energy usage is higher in Sweden. There's a higher load factor. And China, which is third, has the highest load factor, although it is number 3 in terms of installed capacity. And then we have Iceland, so of course we have one Icelander for 1,000 people in the US. So on that scale, it really is important to us. But I want to point out here, Sweden. They don't have any conventional geothermal, no hydrothermal systems. But what has really exploded, both in the United States as well as in Western Europe, mostly within the European Union, is the use of heat pumps. You can really save electric energy with heat pumps, which is like a refrigerator backwards. Instead of cooling a space, you heat up a space by the same technology, which was theoretically pointed out by Lord Kelvin, I think, in 1840, and then technologically developed during the Second World War for the first time 100 years later, but it really didn't take off until about 1990. And if you have a heat pump to use your heat instead of using the electricity directly, you save about 2/3. And this is, of course, very important for a world that is facing shortage of energy resources. And Sweden is already, with geothermal heat pumps, it means you drill a well of 100 or 200 meters. You can do it in your backyard. You get slightly thermal water, and you can have a pipe system going into the well like a loop, and similar to ammonia refrigerator. You can compress the ammonia, you can expand it, and you can extract the heat from a cooler body and put it into a warmer body. And this is going to, I think, continue to increase enormously to save on fossil fuel. So if we look at this by the type of use, direct energy by type of use, you can see heat pumps, and now, well, this was in 2005, it was already on top in 2005, just more than bathing, which is important in Japan, Iceland, Turkey, China. These are the most important countries for using this. And then space heating now is third. Of course, heat pumps is for space heating, but it simply is kept separate because of the technology. And then other uses, they are much less. And again, I show this by country. And you can see that it is quite a few countries that use geothermal energy directly. If we look at it, I think I will skip these. I see the time is running late. This is how installed electric energy has increased with time. It's very close to 250 megawatts per year. Now, important for some countries, when you look at China, we have a large power plant in eastern Iceland, a new one of about 700 megawatts. And to point out how small we are, our population, our country, is China commissions a 700 megawatt power plant, one every Tuesday and one every Friday. That is 1,400 megawatts per week, and it's mostly coal. So this is the the increase per year in geothermal compared with just the increase in coal. Our increase in geothermal per year is almost the increase in coal-fired power plants in China in 1 or 2 days. So one must be aware of the scale of these things. And this is how it is by country. For electricity, you can see again the US is on top. It is mostly the geysers in California. There are quite a few in that part of the US. But developing countries come high, like, well, I don't know about Philippines, but it's a relatively poor country. Indonesia is poor, Mexico is poor. So it is an important energy resource for for many poor countries. Let me leave this and now look a little bit at the geology of these resources in Iceland. I've been talking a lot about uses and about the energy situation in the world, but now a little bit of geology. I hope I can keep it simple. On the left, you can see Iceland. It didn't exactly look like this 6 million years ago, as you can see on part A on the left on top. But what this slide is meant to show is the location of two things. The active volcanic belt, where we have the crust is spreading. This is separating the American plate from the Eurasian plate. And then this little circle, which is our hotspot, a mantle plume that goes down several hundreds of kilometers into the mantle, which is a thermal anomaly and a slow upwelling of mantle material, making volcanism in Iceland more intense than to the north and to the south on the mid-Atlantic ridge. So we do not only have a spreading axis, we also have a mantle plume, and this is what makes Iceland special geologically. It really is the only place on Earth where a mid-oceanic ridge is not oceanic in the sense. It comes above the ocean. But then you see what it looks 3 million years ago and what it looks at present. And you can see that this circle, the mantle plume, is really migrating to the east. The volcano which is erupting now is here. This belt here, we have one in the north. It is also here, but it was in a different place. It was really here 6 million years ago. And this volcanic belt is now splitting into two in the south. This one is retreating, and this one is expanding south. Well, we have this big volcano, and the eruption is more like what you see like in Philippines or St. Mount Helens. It's pretty explosive. It's not just smoothly flowing lava that you usually see in Iceland, like in Hawaii. And the reason is that about here, this is the end of crustal extension. So the volcanic activity starts first, and then this extension of the crust or spreading of the crust comes a little later. So this extension is moving south, while extension here is dying out. And in this area, like here, we have this kind of explosive volcanism. Because if we had not the, if we have crustal extension, the magma makes it so easy to the surface. It doesn't have deep roots within the mantle, and we get what we call just tourist eruptions. I'm afraid this is not a tourist eruption. It has caused more disturbance with international flights than any other events since invention of aircraft. Thousands of flights in many days have been cancelled in Europe because of the fine ash high in the atmosphere. But what is happening on this geological time scale, if we look at the red here, it's so expanded this that it's not very clear, but this is the mantle plume. So the mantle plume is moving east relative to the crust or to the plate boundary. You can look at it the other way and say the plate boundary, which is this amber here, is moving west relative to the to this mantle plume. And it was way over there, Greenland, about 70 million years ago, and now it is about here. And what happens then with this mantle plume is that the crust tends to break up above this weakness, above this mantle plume. So we have this situation, mid-Atlantic ridge is here. It used to come straight through, but now it is being, the volcanic belts in Iceland are being shifted east due to the mantle plume relative to the mid-Atlantic ridge to the north and south of the country. Hvað segirðu? Sá næst mættur? Mér var sagt að Brynhild að ég hefði bara frjálsan tíma. Nei, býttu. Okay, I didn't know that this was limited, but the next guy is here. So I need to, sorry. We have two types of volcanic, of geothermal systems in Iceland. Let me just go through this very quickly. We have, within the active volcanic belts, we have volcanic systems that have high temperatures, sometimes magmatic fluids coming in a little bit. But then in older rocks, particularly on the American plate, and we have our own little microplate here in between the two volcanic belts. It's a separate plate because it has its own independent movement. And this is where we have a lot of tectonism, and so we have tectonic geothermal systems in older rocks. And the tectonic activity is really widespread. All these black dots, mostly here, on both sides of the belt here that is dying out, but also up in the north. Everywhere in all of these areas you can see young or modern fractures that, with which the geothermal activity is linked. The volcanic systems, many of them are associated with major volcanic centers. They are not necessarily big volcanoes, and quite a few of them have a caldera, which forms when you empty the magma chamber very rapidly, so the roof collapses into what was the magma chamber. So you have a circular feature, and this is one up in the north. We have many fossil systems, old systems, that formed in the volcanic belts in Iceland, but due to the crustal drifting, they are now in older rock outside. And what is important about these systems is they are eroded, particularly on the east coast, so you can see what their roots look like. I think I'll make this the last one. This is within the city of Reykjavik. We have this black line here, which shows how the temperature in the crust increases with depth outside the geothermal field. The red one shows how it changes with depth within the geothermal field. I hope you can see that this turning point here, which is at 1,000 meters, then above 1,000 meters depth, the temperatures in the rock within the geothermal field in Reykjavik are higher than in the surroundings outside that field. But below these depths, below 1,000 meters, the temperatures are lower. And they are really low. They start increasing here below about 2,000 meters. So this vertical bit is created by, over a long period of time, vertical movement of hot water. At 2,000 meters depth, this movement is slowing down. Permeability is decreasing. But the other thing is, we have cooled the rock here within the geothermal systems at great depths enormously. We have been mining the heat of the rock by the circulation fluid. So at great depths, down to 3,000 meters, the rock is still quite cooled by water going down, picking up heat, cooling the rock at the same time. So this is not a renewable system. And by the amount we use it today, we are enhancing this movement, circulation of groundwater, by pumping out hot water. It will probably last for a few hundreds of years. So it will last longer than coal. But it depends on how intensively we exploit it, how long it lasts. So after all, it is a mine of heat. It is not a renewable resource.